Hello there, and welcome to this Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into something both deeply human and quietly mysterious. We will explore what happens at the very edge of life, in those rare moments when the body begins to shut down, and yet for some, experience seems to continue. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a gentle reminder of how many lives are unfolding at once, each in its own quiet corner of the world. Now, feel free to dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background and allow yourself to sink into a more restful state. There is nothing you need to solve tonight, no conclusion you need to reach, just a slow unfolding, like a thought drifting across a still lake. And as we begin, you might hold on to a single question, not tightly but lightly, almost like something you're willing to forget as you drift towards sleep. What if the end of life is not the end of experience? Imagine for a moment a quiet hospital room. There is a steady rhythm, a soft series of beeps marking each heartbeat. The air is still. Machines glow faintly in the dim light. And then, something changes. The rhythm falters. A pause, then another, until, slowly, the sound disappears altogether. From a medical perspective, this moment is well understood. When the heart stops beating, blood no longer flows to the brain. Within seconds, oxygen levels begin to fall, and without a constant supply of oxygen, the brain, so active, so complex, begins to grow quiet. If you could observe it directly, it would not look dramatic. There would be no sudden flash, no visible collapse, just a gradual fading, like a city at night losing power, one neighborhood at a time, until even the brightest lights dim into silence. Within roughly 10 to 20 seconds, the electrical activity of the brain becomes so faint that it can no longer be clearly detected by medical instruments. The patterns that once carried thoughts, memories, sensations begin to dissolve. From everything we understand about biology, this should be the end of conscious experience. No thoughts, no images, no awareness, only stillness. And yet, for some people, this is not what happens. There are individuals who have come very close to death, whose hearts have stopped, whose breathing has ceased, whose brains have entered this quiet state. And then, against the odds, they return. And when they return, they speak. Not of darkness, not of nothingness, but of experience, clear, vivid, structured experience. Some describe a sense of leaving their body, as if they were no longer located behind their eyes, but somewhere above, observing the scene from a distance. They recall details of the room, the movements of doctors, the sound of voices, sometimes even events that occurred while they were clinically unresponsive. Others speak of a transition, a movement through a kind of space that is difficult to describe, not quite physical, not quite imagined, a passage, often accompanied by a growing sense of calm. And then there are those who describe something even more unexpected, a feeling of peace, not the ordinary kind that comes and goes, but something deeper, a quiet certainty, as if in that moment all fear had simply fallen away, like a weight that was never truly theirs to carry. Time, too, seems to behave differently. What may have lasted only a few minutes in the physical world is experienced as something far longer. Moments stretch, or perhaps they lose their boundaries entirely. Some describe it as if everything were happening at once, not in sequence, but all together, like pages of a book laid open side by side, and when they return, they remember, not vaguely, not like a dream that fades with the morning light, but with a clarity that often surprises even them. Years later, decades even, the memory remains sharp, detailed, difficult to dismiss. Now it would be easy to treat these accounts as simple illusions. After all, the brain under stress can produce unusual experiences. It can distort perception, create vivid imagery, even blur the boundary between what is real and what is imagined. But something about these reports resists that easy explanation, because they are not random, they're not chaotic, they're not fragmented. Instead, they often follow a pattern, a quiet structure, different people from different cultures, different backgrounds, describing experiences that share a similar shape, not identical, but recognizable, like variations of the same melody, played on different instruments. And this is where the question begins to deepen. If the brain is responsible for producing conscious experience, what happens when the brain is no longer functioning in the way it normally does? Can a fading system still generate such clarity? Or are we perhaps missing something subtle about the nature of consciousness itself? These are not questions with simple answers. Even within science, there is no single explanation that accounts for every detail. Some researchers suggest that what people experience in these moments is the result of chemical changes in the brain, shifts in oxygen levels, or the release of certain compounds during extreme stress. Others point out that while these ideas may explain certain aspects, they do not fully capture the consistency, or the structure, or the lasting impact of the experiences being reported. And so we find ourselves in a quiet space between understanding and mystery, not a place of confusion, but a place of curiosity, a place where we can simply observe without rushing to conclude, because at the edge of life, something unexpected seems to happen. Not always, not for everyone, but often enough that it invites us to look a little closer, to listen a little more carefully, and to wonder, gently, whether consciousness is as tightly bound to the body as we have always assumed, or whether, in those final moments, it might begin to loosen, just slightly, like a thread, slipping free. And as that thought settles quietly in the background, we can allow the details of these experiences to unfold more fully, not as proof and not as certainty, but as something softer, something worth exploring, one quiet step at a time. If these experiences were rare, or wildly different each time, it might be easier to set them aside. A handful of unusual stories, told in moments of stress, shaped by imagination or memory. That would feel familiar, understandable, something we already know how to explain. But that is not what researchers began to notice. Instead, as more people were resuscitated after cardiac arrest, and as more of them shared what they remembered, a quiet pattern began to emerge. Not perfectly identical, but unmistakably similar, like hearing the same melody, played by different instruments in different parts of the world. Over the past several decades, doctors and scientists have carefully collected these accounts. Not just casual conversations, but structured interviews, guided questions, attempts to understand not only what people experienced, but how consistent those experiences might be. And what they found was something unexpected. A significant number of people who come close to death, particularly those whose hearts have stopped and later restarted, report experiences that share a recognizable structure. Not everyone, of course. Many people remember nothing at all. For them, the experience is simply a gap, a blank space between one moment and the next. But among those who do recall something, certain themes appear again and again, a sense of leaving the body, a transition through darkness, an encounter with light, a feeling of peace, and sometimes a return. What makes this especially intriguing is not just the repetition, but the way these experiences are described. They're not vague, they're not uncertain. People often speak with a kind of quiet confidence, as if they are describing something that felt more real than ordinary life, not dreamlike, but somehow clearer and perhaps even more curious. These patterns seem to appear across different cultures. Individuals from different countries, different belief systems, different ways of understanding the world often describe experiences that follow a similar shape. The details may vary slightly, the imagery may reflect personal background, but the underlying structure remains familiar. This raises a gentle but persistent question. If these experiences were created entirely by the expectations of the mind, shaped by culture or belief, we might expect them to differ more dramatically. And yet, they do not. Instead, they seem to echo one another, across languages, across continents, across lives that have never intersected. Of course, there are still many possibilities to consider. The human brain, after all, shares a common structure. It responds to stress in similar ways. It processes memory, emotion, and perception using systems that are broadly the same from one person to another. So perhaps, under extreme conditions, the brain produces similar patterns of experience. That is one possibility. But even within that explanation, there are questions that remain. Because these experiences are not only similar, they are often organized. They unfold with a kind of sequence, not random flashes of imagery, but a progression, a beginning, a middle, an end. And this sense of structure is important. Think about how ordinary dreams often feel. They can be vivid, even emotional, but they're usually fragmented. Scenes shift without warning. Logic dissolves. Time stretches or collapses in unpredictable ways. Near-death experiences, on the other hand, are often described differently. There is a sense of movement, of transition, of continuity, as if the experience is unfolding along a path rather than scattering in all directions. This does not mean they are identical. There is still variation. Some people report only a single element, a feeling of peace, perhaps, or a brief sense of detachment. Others describe a more extended sequence, with multiple stages, but even in their differences, there is a quiet familiarity, and this is what continues to draw attention, not because it proves anything, but because it invites deeper observation. It suggests that whatever is happening in these moments, it may not be entirely random. It may follow patterns that we're only beginning to recognize. And when patterns appear, especially in something as complex as human experience, they tend to signal that there is an underlying process at work, a process that we may not yet fully understand, but one that is worth exploring, slowly, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. There is another detail that often goes unnoticed at first. These experiences are not always shaped by expectation. In some cases, individuals report near-death experiences that differ from their own beliefs. A person with no strong spiritual framework may describe encounters that feel deeply meaningful. Someone who did not expect anything beyond death may return with memories that challenge their previous assumptions, and while belief can certainly influence interpretation, it does not always determine the experience itself. This adds another layer of quiet complexity, because it suggests that these experiences are not simply reflections of what people expect to find, but something that emerges, perhaps, from deeper within the mind, or beyond it. Again, we're not forced to choose an explanation. We're simply noticing, watching as the pieces begin to take shape. And as we continue, we can begin to look more closely at one of the most commonly reported aspects of these experiences, the feeling of being somewhere else, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a way that feels spatial, almost physical, as if the point of awareness has shifted gently away from the body itself, and in that shift, something remarkable begins to unfold. As these experiences begin to unfold, one of the most commonly described moments is also one of the most difficult to explain. A quiet shift, not in the body, but in the sense of where you are. Many people who come close to death describe a feeling of no longer being located inside their body, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but almost as if their point of awareness has gently moved, like a camera lifting upward, changing its angle without making a sound. They describe looking down, seeing their own body from above, lying still, surrounded by doctors, nurses, or family members. The room appears familiar, yet somehow distant, as if they are both part of it, and separate from it at the same time. What is striking is not only the perspective, but the clarity. These are not described as vague impressions or blurred images. Many people recall details with surprising precision: the position of objects, the movement of people, the tone of voices, sometimes even small, seemingly insignificant actions that occurred while they were, from a medical point of view, completely unresponsive. Of course, this is where the questions begin, because from a scientific perspective, perception requires a functioning system. To see, light must enter the eyes, signals must travel along delicate pathways, and the brain must interpret those signals into a coherent image. To hear, vibrations in the air must be detected, translated, and processed. And yet, during cardiac arrest or deep unconsciousness, these systems are not operating in their usual way. The body is still, the eyes are closed, the brain's activity is diminished to a quiet, fragile state. So how, then, do these experiences arise? One possibility is that what people are recalling is not a real-time perception, but a reconstruction. The brain, even under extreme conditions, can generate internal imagery. It can piece together fragments of memory, expectation, and imagination, and weave them into something that feels real. In everyday life, we see hints of this ability. When you remember a familiar room, you can almost see it in your mind. You can picture where things are, how the light falls across the space, even without opening your eyes. Perhaps, in moments of extreme stress, this ability becomes amplified. That is one way to understand it, and yet, there are cases that sit quietly at the edge of that explanation. There are reports, carefully documented, where individuals describe events that occurred during the time they were unconscious, and later, those details appear to match what actually happened. A specific conversation between medical staff, an object placed in a particular location, a sequence of actions, recalled in the correct order. These accounts are not always easy to verify, and they are not always perfect. Memory is, after all, a delicate thing. It can shift, change, and adapt over time. But even so, the consistency of certain reports has led researchers to look more closely. Not to confirm a conclusion, but to better understand the phenomenon itself. And perhaps what is most important is not whether every detail is accurate, but the experience as it is felt. Because for the person undergoing it, the sensation is often unmistakable. They are not dreaming. They are not imagining. They feel present, aware, observing, and yet they are not within the body. This creates a quiet paradox. If consciousness is entirely dependent on the physical processes of the brain, then how does it seem to separate from the body in this way? On the other hand, if consciousness can exist independently, then what we're seeing here may be a glimpse, not of something supernatural, but of something we have not yet learned to fully describe. Again, there is no need to decide. We are simply noticing the shape of the question, and as we continue to explore, another subtle detail begins to emerge. During these out-of-body experiences, people often report a sense of calm, not confusion, not panic, but a kind of gentle clarity. Even when the situation around their body is urgent, even chaotic, their awareness remains steady. It is as if the emotional weight of the moment was being lifted, like stepping outside of a storm and finding that beyond the wind and rain, there is stillness. This emotional tone is important because it contrasts with what we might expect. In moments of danger, the body typically responds with urgency. The heart races, the mind sharpens, fear becomes a guiding force, and yet, in these reports, fear is often absent. Instead, there is observation, presence, and sometimes a quiet curiosity. It is as though the experience is not driven by survival, but by awareness itself. And then, just as gently as it began, the experience shifts. The sense of observing from above begins to fade. Attention moves elsewhere, not back into the body, not yet, but forward, or perhaps inward, into something that feels less like a place and more like a transition, a movement, a passage. And in that movement, many describe entering a space that is no longer connected to the physical world in any obvious way, a space that feels different, not empty, but not quite solid either, as if reality itself has softened, becoming more fluid, more open. It is here that another common element begins to take shape, a sense of being drawn, gently, towards something ahead, not with force, not with urgency, but with a quiet inevitability, like drifting along a current you cannot see, but somehow trust. And as that movement continues, the darkness ahead does not remain empty. It begins to change, subtly at first, and then more clearly, as if something is waiting just beyond the edge of perception. As the sense of observing from above begins to fade, many describe a gentle change in direction, not a sudden movement, not a sharp turn, but a quiet drifting, as if awareness itself is being carried somewhere, without effort. The surroundings, which once resembled the familiar shapes of a hospital room or a physical space, begin to soften. Edges lose their sharpness. The sense of distance becomes difficult to define, and what remains is not so much a place, but a feeling of movement. Some describe it as passing through darkness, not an empty or frightening darkness, but something more like a quiet space, similar to closing your eyes in a calm room, where there is no light, but also no discomfort. Others speak of a tunnel, though even that word, tunnel, may not fully capture the experience. It is less like a solid structure and more like a direction, a sense of moving forward through something that gently narrows, guiding attention toward a single point, a point that begins, slowly, to glow. At first, it may appear distant, a faint brightness, almost like the first hint of dawn appearing at the horizon, and then, gradually, it grows, not in a way that overwhelms, but in a way that invites. Many who describe this moment struggle to find words that feel accurate. The light is not just seen, it is felt. It carries a presence, a quality that is difficult to compare to anything in ordinary life. It is often described as warm, not in temperature, but in tone, like being understood, without needing to explain anything. like being welcomed without needing to arrive. And perhaps most notably, the light is not experienced as blinding, even though it may be brighter than anything encountered in everyday life. It does not hurt the eyes. There is no need to look away. Instead, there is a natural ease, a sense that the experience is perfectly suited to the one perceiving it. This detail may seem small, but it carries significance, because in the physical world, light of sufficient brightness tends to overwhelm our senses. It forces us to close our eyes, to turn away. And yet here, the experience is different. It is as if perception itself has changed, adapting to something that is no longer limited by the usual constraints of the body. Alongside this light, there is often a profound shift in emotion. Earlier, during the moment of separation from the body, there may have been calm, a quiet clarity. But here, that calm deepens into something more expansive, a feeling that is often described as peace, not the kind that comes from resolving a problem or escaping a difficulty, but something more fundamental, a sense that everything is, in some way, okay, that nothing is missing, that nothing needs to be fixed, and within that feeling, there is often a sense of connection, not necessarily to a specific person or place, but to something larger, something that feels familiar, even if it cannot be named. Some describe it as returning, not to a location, but to a state of being, as if they had for a brief moment stepped outside of the ordinary boundaries of life and found themselves somewhere that felt deeply known, even if they had never been there before. It is important to pause here and consider how such experiences might arise. From a scientific perspective, the brain under extreme conditions can produce powerful sensations. Changes in oxygen levels, shifts in the balance of gases in the blood, the release of certain natural compounds, all of these can influence perception. Under these conditions, visual experiences may become simplified, focused, drawn toward a central point. The brain, attempting to make sense of limited input, might create a sense of movement, a narrowing field, a light at the center. This is one way to understand the tunnel-like experience, and it may explain part of what people report. But as with many aspects of near-death experiences, it does not explain everything, because the experience is not only visual, it is emotional, relational. It carries a sense of meaning, not just sensation. And meaning is something that is not easily reduced to physical processes alone. At the same time, we must remain gentle in how we hold these observations. There's no need to choose one explanation over another. The goal is not to prove or to dismiss, but to notice, to observe the details, the patterns, the consistency, and allow them to exist without forcing them into a final shape. Because what we're exploring is not only a set of events, but a boundary, a place where our current understanding begins to thin, where familiar explanations become less certain, and where new questions begin to form. And perhaps that is where the value lies, not in arriving at a conclusion, but in allowing the question to remain open long enough for deeper insight to emerge. As the light grows nearer and the sense of peace deepens, many describe a feeling that something is about to happen, not something sudden or dramatic, but something meaningful, as if they are approaching a threshold, a point of transition, and just beyond that threshold, something or someone seems to be waiting. As that quiet sense of approach deepens, many people describe a moment that feels less like entering a place and more like being received, not by something distant, but by something aware. It is often difficult to describe exactly what is encountered. Some speak of a presence, others of a being, and some simply say, There was something there, something that understood them completely. Not in words, not through conversation in the way we usually think of it, but through a kind of direct knowing, as if communication no longer needed sound, or language, or even time to unfold. It happens all at once, an exchange, without sentences, a recognition, without introduction. And within that moment, there is often a feeling that nothing is hidden. Every thought, every memory, every small detail of a person's life is somehow visible, not in a way that feels invasive, but in a way that feels natural, like opening a book that has always been there and realizing it has already been read and understood completely. This is where another commonly reported experience begins to unfold, a return, not to the body, but to memory, but not in the way we usually remember things. In everyday life, memory is often selective. We recall fragments, pieces, moments that stand out, while others fade quietly into the background. And even when we remember clearly, it is usually from a single perspective, our own. Here, the experience is different. People describe what is often called a life review, but that phrase can be misleading because it sounds passive, as if one were watching a sequence of events on a screen. What is described is something more immersive. Moments from one's life appear, not as distant images, but as lived experiences. Events unfold again, but this time they are felt more fully, not only from one's own perspective, but sometimes from the perspective of others. A simple conversation, a passing interaction, a decision made quickly, without much thought, may return, expanded. And within that expansion comes understanding. How a word affected someone, how a small gesture lingered, how something that felt insignificant at the time carried more weight than expected. And this understanding is not accompanied by judgment. There is no voice declaring right or wrong, no sense of punishment or reward. Instead, there is clarity, a kind of quiet awareness that allows each moment to be seen, not through the lens of defense or justification, but as it simply is. And within that clarity, there is often a feeling of compassion, not only for others, but for oneself. Mistakes are recognized, but they are not met with harshness. Instead, they are understood as part of a larger process, something that could be learned from, rather than condemned. This aspect of the experience is often one of the most impactful, because it reframes how a life is seen, not as a series of successes and failures, but as a collection of moments, each carrying its own meaning, its own opportunity for understanding. And alongside this, there is often a sense of connection. The presence that is encountered, whatever form it takes, is not experienced as distant or separate. It feels close, familiar, and deeply aware. Some describe it as a kind of light, not just visual, but intelligent, responsive. Others describe it in more personal terms, as if meeting someone who knows them completely and accepts them without condition. Again, the language varies, but the feeling remains consistent, a sense of being known and accepted without needing to explain anything. This raises another quiet question, because in ordinary life, understanding takes time. It requires communication, context, interpretation. We learn about one another slowly, through conversation and experience. But here, understanding seems immediate, direct, as if the usual boundaries of thought and language have been set aside. From a scientific perspective, there are ways to approach this. The brain is capable of integrating vast amounts of information. Under certain conditions, it can create experiences that feel deeply meaningful, connecting emotions and memories in powerful ways. In moments of extreme stress or altered states, these processes may become intensified. Memories may surface rapidly, associations may form more freely, and the result may be an experience that feels like a complete understanding. That is one way to describe it, and it may account for part of what is happening. But as with other aspects of near-death experiences, it does not fully capture the depth or the consistency of what is being reported, because what stands out is not only the content of the experience, but its tone, the absence of fear, the presence of calm, the sense that whatever is happening is not threatening. Even when the life review includes difficult moments, there is no sense of being judged by an external force. Instead, it feels as though understanding itself is the focus, learning rather than evaluation. And this shift from judgment to understanding carries a certain quiet significance. It suggests a different way of relating to experience, one that is less about measuring and more about seeing, less about assigning value and more about recognizing connection. And for many people, this becomes one of the lasting impressions they carry back with them, because eventually the experience changes again. The sense of presence remains, but something begins to shift, a feeling that there is a boundary or a choice, or perhaps a moment of transition approaching, not forced, not urgent, but inevitable. And within that moment, there is often a sense that returning is possible, that the experience, as complete as it may feel, is not yet final. And so, gently, almost reluctantly, awareness begins to turn back toward the body, back toward the world, back toward the life that was briefly set aside. But something has changed, something quiet and difficult to describe. And even as the memory begins to settle, it does not fade in the way ordinary experiences do. It remains clear, present, like a reflection that continues to reveal new details each time it is revisited. After hearing these experiences, it is natural to wonder what is happening in the body at the same time, while the mind may feel as though it is travelling, observing, remembering. The physical body is undergoing something very different, something far more fragile. To understand this, we can return gently to that quiet hospital room, the moment when the heart stops, when the steady rhythm disappears, and the body enters a state that doctors call cardiac arrest. This does not mean the body is gone, but it does mean that the systems we rely on every moment have been interrupted. The heart, which normally pumps blood through an intricate network of vessels, suddenly falls still, and with that stillness, the flow of oxygen to the brain begins to slow and then stop. The brain, despite its remarkable complexity, is also deeply dependent on this constant flow. It cannot store much energy. It cannot wait long. Within just a few seconds, changes begin. Not dramatic ones, not visible from the outside, but subtle shifts in activity. The countless tiny signals that move through the brain, carrying thoughts, sensations, awareness, begin to weaken. You might imagine it like a vast city at night, where millions of lights remain on only as long as power continues to flow. At first, nothing seems to change. Then, one building goes dark, then another, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, entire sections begin to fade. The city is still there, the structures remain, but the activity, the movement, the life within it begins to quiet. In the brain, something similar happens. The organised patterns of activity, the ones that allow us to think clearly, to perceive the world, to feel present, begin to dissolve. Within roughly 10 to 20 seconds, the signals become so faint that they're difficult to detect with the tools doctors use to observe brain activity. From a clinical perspective, this is a critical threshold. It suggests that the brain is no longer functioning in the way required for normal conscious experience. And yet, this is also the moment where the story becomes more complex, because in recent years, researchers have begun to notice that this quieting is not always complete, and not always final. In some cases, during attempts to revive the body through careful medical intervention, there are brief periods where the brain shows signs of organised activity. Not the steady, familiar patterns of everyday consciousness, but something structured, coordinated, as if, even in this fragile state, the brain is capable of brief moments of reorganization. These moments are not fully understood, they do not last long, and they do not necessarily correspond directly to the experiences people later describe. But their presence introduces an important nuance. It suggests that the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness may not be as sharply defined as we once believed. Instead, it may be more like a gradual fading, with brief flickers of activity, appearing and disappearing, like embers in a fire that has nearly gone out, still glowing faintly beneath the surface. This does not mean that consciousness is fully present in those moments, but it does mean that the brain, even under extreme conditions, may not be entirely silent. And this raises a quiet question. If the brain is only partially active, or intermittently active, could it still generate experiences? Could it produce the vivid, structured, emotionally rich moments that people later describe? Some researchers believe it can. They suggest that during these extreme states, the brain may enter a kind of altered mode, a mode where normal boundaries are loosened, where different regions of the brain, areas that do not usually communicate so directly, begin to interact in new ways. This could lead to unusual perceptions, intense emotions, a sense of unity or clarity that is not typical in everyday life. In this view, near-death experiences are not evidence of something beyond the brain, but rather an expression of the brain under extraordinary conditions, a final surge, perhaps, of integrated activity before the system fully shuts down. It is a compelling idea, and it is supported by some observations, but like many explanations in this area, it does not resolve everything, because the experiences themselves remain remarkably consistent, remarkably structured, and often remarkably clear. Which brings us back to the central tension. On one side, the biology, the fading activity, the fragile dependent nature of the brain. On the other, the reports of awareness, of observation, of memory, not vague, not chaotic, but coherent. And so, rather than forcing these two perspectives into agreement, we can allow them to sit side by side. The brain growing quiet, and experience somehow continuing, not as a contradiction, but as a question that invites us to look more closely, not only at what happens in the body, but what we mean when we speak of consciousness itself. Because perhaps what we're observing here is not simply the shutting down of a system, but the edge of something we do not yet fully understand. And as we continue, we will begin to explore the different ways scientists have tried to explain these experiences and why, even after many years of study, the picture remains incomplete. As the brain grows quiet, it might seem as though the story should simply end there. A gradual fading, soft dimming of activity until nothing remains. And for a long time, That is exactly how this moment was understood. When the heart stops, the brain is deprived of the steady flow of oxygen and nutrients it needs. Without that flow, the delicate balance that sustains thought and awareness begins to unravel, signals weaken, patterns dissolve, and eventually, the system appears to fall silent. But in recent years, something unexpected has begun to emerge from careful observation. Not something dramatic, not a sudden return to full awareness, but something quieter, and perhaps more intriguing. In some cases, when doctors attempt to restart the heart, there are brief periods during which the brain shows signs of organised activity. Not random flickers, not chaotic noise, but patterns that resemble in certain ways the coordinated activity seen during conscious states. These moments are rare and often very short. They do not last long enough to form a complete picture, and they do not necessarily align neatly with the experiences people later describe. But their existence introduces a subtle shift in how we understand the boundary between life and death, because rather than a clean, immediate transition, what we begin to see is something more gradual, a fading, followed by brief returns, a quiet landscape where activity diminishes but does not always vanish completely. You might imagine it like the surface of a lake at dusk. As the light fades, the water grows still, the reflections soften, the details become harder to see, and yet, every so often, a ripple appears, a small movement, interrupting the calm. Not enough to restore the full image, but enough to suggest that something is still happening beneath the surface. In the brain, these brief moments of activity may represent something similar, a temporary reorganization, a short-lived coordination between different regions, as if the system, even in its weakened state, is still capable of forming patterns before fading once more. Scientists are still trying to understand exactly what these patterns mean. Do they reflect the final stages of a system shutting down? Or do they represent something more active, a last effort to integrate information, to maintain coherence? Even in the face of collapse, there is no simple answer. But what is clear is that the process is not as binary as it once seemed. It is not simply on or off. Instead, it appears to move through phases, moments of silence, followed by brief returns of structure. And within that shifting landscape, the possibility arises that experience, in some form, may still be present, even if only for a short time. This idea leads to an important question. If the brain can produce brief periods of organised activity during resuscitation, could these moments be responsible for the experiences people later report? Could the sense of leaving the body, the movement through darkness, the encounter with light, all occur within these fleeting windows? It is a possibility that many researchers consider, because it offers a way to connect the biological observations with the reported experiences, a bridge between what can be measured and what is described. But like many bridges in this area, it does not reach all the way across, because the experiences themselves often feel longer, more continuous, more structured than what these brief moments of activity might suggest. People describe sequences, transitions, interactions that unfold with a sense of time, even if that sense of time is different from the one we know. And this creates a gentle tension. On one side, the measurable, short bursts of organised brain activity, appearing and disappearing. On the other, the subjective, experiences that feel extended, coherent, and deeply meaningful. To reconcile these two perspectives, some researchers suggest that time, as it is experienced in the mind, may not match time as it is measured in the body. In everyday life, we already see hints of this. A dream that seems to last for hours, may unfold in just a few minutes, a moment of danger can feel stretched, as if time itself has slowed. Perhaps, in these extreme states, the sense of time becomes even more flexible. A brief period of activity might be experienced as something much longer, a few seconds, unfolding into a sequence that feels complete. This does not solve the mystery, but it offers a way of thinking about it, a way that keeps both the biological and the experiential aspects in view, without forcing one to cancel out the other. And so, we remain in this quiet space of observation, not choosing one explanation over another, but allowing each to contribute something to the picture, because what we are seeing is not a simple process. It is layered, subtle, and still unfolding in our understanding. As research continues, new data will emerge, new patterns may be discovered, and with them, new ways of thinking about what happens at the edge of life. But for now, we can rest with what we know, that the brain, even in its most fragile state, is not entirely silent, that brief moments of organization can appear, like faint signals in the distance, and that within those moments, there may be enough structure to give rise to experience, or at least to something that feels very much like it. And as we continue this quiet exploration, we will begin to look more closely at the many different explanations that have been proposed, and why, despite decades of study, none of them seem to fully account for everything that is observed. As we sit with these quiet observations, the fading of the brain, the brief return of organized activity, the structured experiences that some people recall, it becomes natural to ask a simple question. How do we explain this? Over the years, scientists, doctors, and researchers have proposed many different ideas, not one or two, but dozens, each one attempting to describe a small part of what is happening from a physical, measurable perspective. If we gather them together, they form something like a collection of lenses. Each lens brings a certain detail into focus, but none reveals the entire landscape. One of the most commonly discussed explanations involves the idea of oxygen. When the brain is deprived of oxygen, its normal functioning begins to change. Visual perception may narrow. The edges of the visual field may fade, leaving a brighter center. In everyday terms, you might imagine looking through a wide window, and slowly the sides begin to darken, until only a small circle of light remains. This could help explain why some people report the sensation of moving through a tunnel toward a point of brightness. Another explanation focuses on the buildup of certain gases in the blood. When breathing stops or becomes irregular, levels of carbon dioxide can rise. This can influence how the brain processes sensory information, sometimes leading to unusual visual or auditory experiences. In simpler terms, the internal environment of the brain shifts, and perception shifts along with it. There are also ideas related to the release of natural chemicals within the brain. Under extreme stress, the body can release substances that affect mood, perception, and awareness. Some of these substances are associated with feelings of calm, or even euphoria. This could help explain the deep sense of peace, the absence of fear that many people describe during near-death experiences. Another group of explanations looks at electrical activity. As the brain's normal patterns begin to break down, there may be brief bursts of activity, signals firing in unusual ways. These bursts could create vivid internal imagery or a sense of movement, even in the absence of external input. And then there are explanations based on memory. The brain is constantly storing and organizing experiences. Under certain conditions, it may rapidly access and combine these memories, creating the impression of reliving events or moving through a sequence of meaningful moments. This could relate to the life review, the sense of revisiting one's past with heightened clarity. Each of these ideas has some support. Each can account for certain features of near-death experiences, and taken together, they form a complex layered picture. But even when combined, something remains incomplete. Because while these explanations describe how certain sensations might arise, they do not fully explain why the experiences are often so structured, why they follow a recognizable pattern, why they carry a consistent emotional tone, and why they are remembered with such clarity long after the event has passed. If near-death experiences were simply the result of random activity, we might expect them to be chaotic, disjointed, unpredictable. But that is not what is most commonly reported. Instead, there is a sense of coherence, a beginning, a progression, a transition, and within that progression, a kind of meaning, not imposed afterward, but present within the experience itself. This is where the number of explanations becomes significant, because rather than converging on a single, unified theory, the field remains scattered. More than 30 different ideas have been proposed, each addressing a different aspect, each leaving certain questions unanswered. You might think of it like trying to understand a piece of music. By examining only one instrument at a time, the rhythm may be clear, or the melody, or the harmony, but without hearing them together, something essential is missing. In the same way, these explanations, while valuable, do not yet form a complete picture. They describe pieces of the experience, but not the experience as a whole. And this does not mean that the answer lies beyond science. It simply means that the current models may not yet be sufficient. There may be factors we do not fully understand, processes that are more complex than we have realized, or connections between different systems that we have not yet mapped. At the same time, it is important to remain grounded. The presence of unanswered questions does not automatically point to a single alternative explanation. It does not confirm that consciousness exists independently of the brain, but it does suggest that the relationship between the two may be more subtle than we have assumed. Rather than a simple cause and effect, it may involve layers, interactions, feedback loops, and perhaps, under certain conditions, these layers behave in ways that are not immediately intuitive. So once again, we find ourselves in a space of quiet uncertainty, not confusion, but openness, a willingness to hold multiple possibilities without forcing them into a final conclusion. Because sometimes, understanding does not come from choosing a single answer, but from allowing the question to deepen until new ways of seeing begin to emerge. And as we continue this gentle exploration, we will begin to look more closely at some of the experiences that challenge these explanations most directly. Moments that are more difficult to describe as internal constructions, and that invite us to consider whether perception itself might not be as tightly bound to the physical body as we once believed. As we continue to explore these experiences, there are certain moments that seem to rest just beyond the edge of easy explanation. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but quietly, persistently, unusual. Up to this point, we have seen how near-death experiences can be described through patterns, through changes in the brain, through the ways memory and perception may shift under extreme conditions. And many of those ideas offer something valuable. They help us understand how such experiences could arise. But every so often, a detail appears that does not fit comfortably within those explanations. A small piece that invites us to pause, to look again. One of those pieces involves perception itself, the simple act of seeing or hearing, which we often take for granted. In everyday life, these senses depend on the body. Light enters the eyes, is converted into signals, and interpreted by the brain. Sound travels through the air, reaches the ears, and becomes something we recognize as voices or music. Without these pathways, perception, as we understand it, should not occur. And yet, there are reports, carefully documented, where individuals describe something different. There are cases where people who were born without sight, or who lost their vision early in life, report visual experiences during near-death states, not vague impressions, not abstract sensations, but descriptions that include shape, movement, even the presence of light. For someone who has never experienced vision in the ordinary sense, this raises a quiet question. What does it mean to see in such a context? Is it truly visual in the way we understand it? Or is it something else? Something that simply feels like seeing? Similarly, there are accounts from individuals who have lived without hearing, who describe communication during these experiences, not through sound, not through spoken language, but through a kind of direct understanding, as if meaning itself is shared, without the need for words, thought, meeting thought, awareness, meeting awareness. These reports are not universal. They do not occur in every case, and they are often difficult to verify with complete certainty. Memory, after all, is not a perfect recording. It can shift over time, influenced by reflection, by retelling, by the natural processes of the mind. So it is important to approach these accounts with care, not as proof, not as final answers, but as observations, moments that have been reported and that deserve to be considered gently, without rushing to explain them away or elevate them beyond what can be supported. From a scientific perspective, there are possible ways to think about these experiences. The brain is remarkably flexible. Even in individuals who lack one sense, other forms of perception can become more refined. The brain can adapt, reorganize, and create internal representations that do not rely on typical sensory input. In this view, what is described as seeing may not be visual in the usual sense, but rather a form of spatial awareness or mental imagery, experienced in a way that feels vivid and real. And what is described as hearing may be a form of understanding, a direct processing of meaning, without the intermediate step of sound. These interpretations offer a way to remain grounded, while still acknowledging the depth of the experience. But even with these explanations, something remains quietly intriguing, because the people who report these moments often describe them with a clarity and a confidence that feels different from imagination. They do not speak as though they are guessing, they speak as though they remember. And that difference, while subtle, carries weight. It suggests that whatever is happening is not easily dismissed as random or disorganized. Instead, it appears to follow its own internal logic, its own form of coherence. And perhaps that is the most important detail, not whether the experience is visual or auditory in the physical sense, but that it is structured, meaningful, consistent enough to be recognized across different individuals, even those whose everyday sensory experiences are very different. This brings us back, once again, to the quiet space between explanation and mystery. On one side, we have the adaptability of the brain, its ability to generate internal worlds, to simulate perception, to create experiences that feel real. On the other, we have reports that seem to extend beyond the limits of those familiar processes, not contradicting them directly, but stretching them, inviting us to consider whether perception itself might be more flexible, more layered than we usually imagine, and perhaps, in these moments at the edge of life, those layers become more visible, not because something entirely new is created, but because something usually hidden is briefly revealed. A different way of knowing, a different way of experiencing, not bound as tightly to the physical pathways we rely on every day. And yet, even here, it is important to remain gentle, to hold these ideas lightly, because the goal is not to replace one certainty with another, but to allow the question to deepen just enough to see a little further. And as we continue, another detail begins to come into focus, not what is experienced, but how it is remembered. Because even long after the body has recovered and life has returned to its familiar rhythm, these experiences do not simply fade, they remain clear, present, as if they belong to a different kind of memory altogether. As these experiences settle into memory, something else begins to stand out, not just what was experienced, but how it is remembered. In everyday life, memory has a certain softness to it. Moments blur at the edges, details fade, even important events, ones we once felt deeply, can lose their clarity over time. We may remember the general shape of what happened, but the fine details begin to slip away, like footprints slowly disappearing in sand. This is a natural part of how the mind works. Memory is not a perfect recording. It is a process, one that reshapes and reorganizes what we recall each time we revisit it. It fills in gaps, it smooths over inconsistencies, it changes quietly as we change. And yet, when people speak about near-death experiences, they often describe something different. They speak of memories that remain unusually clear, not just days or weeks after the event, but years later, sometimes decades. The details do not seem to fade in the same way. The sequence remains intact, the emotions just as vivid as when they were first felt. It is as if the experience has been preserved, not as a fragile impression, but as something more stable, more defined. Some individuals describe these memories as being more real than ordinary life, not in the sense that they replace reality, but in the sense that they carry a kind of clarity that is difficult to match. Colours seem sharper, emotions feel deeper, the sense of presence more complete. This does not mean the memory is immune to change. All memory evolves to some degree, but the consistency of these reports has drawn attention, because they suggest that something about the way these experiences are encoded may be different. In the brain, memory is typically formed through patterns of activity. When we experience something, networks of cells become active together. Over time, these patterns can be strengthened, allowing the memory to be recalled later. But memory is also influenced by attention, by emotion, by significance. The more meaningful an experience feels, the more likely it is to be remembered clearly. And near-death experiences, by their nature, are often deeply meaningful. They occur at a moment when the boundary between life and death feels close, when attention is focused, when emotion is heightened, when the ordinary distractions of daily life fall away. In such conditions, it is possible that memory becomes more strongly encoded, more deeply imprinted. This offers one way to understand the clarity, but even here, questions remain, because it is not only the intensity of the memory, but its stability. In many cases, these memories do not fragment over time. They do not lose their structure. They remain coherent, almost untouched by the usual process of fading and reshaping. You might imagine it like writing in different materials. Some memories are like lines drawn in water, shifting as the surface moves. Others are like marks in sand, gradually softened by wind. But these seem closer to something carved in stone, still present even as everything around them changes. There is another detail, subtle but important. People often report that recalling these memories does not feel like remembering something distant. It feels immediate, as if the experience is still accessible, just beneath the surface. Not something that has been stored away, but something that can be returned to, almost as it was. This quality is not unique to near-death experiences, but it is rare. It is sometimes found in moments of intense emotion, or in events that carry deep personal significance. But here, it appears with a certain consistency, and that consistency invites reflection. Because if these experiences were simply the result of disorganized brain activity, we might expect the memories to be unstable, fragmented, difficult to recall in detail, but instead, they often show the opposite pattern: clarity, structure, endurance. This does not mean that the experiences are necessarily external or independent of the brain. It simply suggests that whatever processes are involved, they are capable of producing memories that differ from the usual pattern. From a scientific point of view, this may point to a unique state of the brain, a state in which attention, emotion, and perception are aligned in a way that strengthens memory formation. Or perhaps, a state in which the usual filters that shape experience are loosened, allowing more detail to be captured. There is also the possibility that the meaning of the experience itself plays a role. Events that reshape how we see the world tend to be remembered more clearly. They're revisited more often, reflected upon, integrated into our sense of identity. And through that repeated engagement, they remain vivid. But even with these explanations, something remains quietly remarkable. Because these memories do not feel like interpretations, they feel like direct recollections, not constructed over time, but preserved. And for those who carry them, they often become a point of reference, a moment that stands apart from the rest of life, not because it is separate, but because it feels, somehow, deeper. And as we follow this thread a little further, another pattern begins to emerge. Not only are these experiences remembered clearly, they are often described as unfolding in a way that feels organized, not scattered, not random, but guided, as if following a path. And it is this sense of structure, this quiet unfolding from one moment to the next, that we will begin to explore more closely. As these memories remain clear and accessible, another quiet pattern begins to emerge, not only in what people remember, but in how those memories unfold. Because when individuals describe their experiences, they rarely speak of fragments. They do not describe scattered images, disconnected scenes, or abrupt shifts without meaning. Instead, there is often a sense of progression, a gentle movement from one stage to another, a beginning, a middle, and something that feels like an ending, even if the experience itself is not fully complete. This structure does not appear rigid, like a script that must be followed, but it does appear consistent enough to be recognized. Many accounts begin with a moment of separation, a feeling of leaving the body or observing from a distance, then a transition, movement through darkness, or through a space that feels different from the physical world. After that, an encounter with light, with presence, with memory, or with something that feels aware, and then, in many cases, a return, not sudden, not forced, but gradual, like waking from a deep and meaningful dream. This sequence is not universal. Not everyone experiences every stage, and the details can vary. But the overall shape appears again and again, and that shape carries significance, because it suggests that these experiences are not entirely random. They are not simply bursts of imagery or isolated sensations. They have direction, continuity, a sense of unfolding. To understand why this is unusual, we can think about how the mind behaves in more familiar altered states. Consider a dream. Dreams can be vivid, emotional, even profound, but they are often unpredictable. Scenes shift without warning. A familiar place becomes unfamiliar. Time stretches or collapses without a clear sense of sequence. You may find yourself in one situation and then suddenly in another, without knowing how you arrived there. There is often no clear beginning and no defined path from one moment to the next. Instead, there is fluidity, movement without structure, a kind of creative unfolding that does not follow the logic of waking life. Near-death experiences, as they are often described, feel different. They are not entirely bound by physical reality, but they do not lose coherence. There is a sense that each part of the experience connects to the next, that there is a flow, even if it is subtle. This does not mean that they are more real than dreams, but it does suggest that they are organized in a different way. You might imagine the difference like this. A dream is like a series of scattered clouds drifting across the sky, forming and dissolving without a clear path. A near-death experience, in contrast, is more like a river. It may bend, it may change direction, but it continues to move, carrying everything along a single course. This sense of flow is one of the reasons why these experiences leave such a strong impression, because the mind is not only observing, it is participating in something that feels continuous, meaningful, complete in its own way. From a scientific perspective, this raises interesting questions, because the brain, under normal conditions, relies on coordinated activity across many regions to maintain a sense of continuity, to create the feeling that one moment follows another, that events unfold in a sequence. When these systems are disrupted, as they often are during extreme stress, we might expect continuity to break down, to become fragmented, and yet, in these reports, continuity often remains, which suggests that whatever processes are involved, they are capable of maintaining a form of organization, even under unusual conditions. Some researchers suggest that this may be due to the brain entering a different mode of operation, one in which internal narratives become more dominant, shaping the experience into a coherent story. Others propose that the sense of structure may arise from the way memory is reconstructed after the fact, organizing the experience into a sequence that feels natural. These ideas offer possible explanations, and they may account for part of what is happening, but once again, they do not fully dissolve the mystery, because the consistency of the sequence across different individuals suggests that there may be underlying patterns guiding the experience itself, not imposed afterward, but present from the beginning. And so, we arrive at another quiet threshold. We have seen that these experiences are not only vivid and not only remembered clearly, but also structured. They unfold with a sense of direction, of movement, of continuity. And this brings us gently to a deeper question. If the brain is responsible for organizing experience in this way, what happens when the usual systems are disrupted? How is this structure maintained? Or is it possible that what we are observing is not entirely dependent on those systems? This is not a question that demands an immediate answer. It is a question that invites exploration. because to understand these experiences more fully, we may need to look beyond the events themselves and begin to consider something more fundamental: the nature of consciousness, not only what it does, but what it is, and whether it is something that is created entirely by the brain, or something that the brain, in some way, allows us to access. As these experiences begin to gather, patterns, memory, structure, they quietly lead us toward a deeper question, not just about what happens at the edge of life, but about something more fundamental. What is consciousness? In everyday thinking, the answer often feels straightforward. We tend to imagine consciousness as something the brain produces, a result of countless tiny processes, signals moving through networks, combining into thoughts, sensations, awareness. In this view, the brain is like a generator. When it is active, consciousness is present. When it becomes quiet, consciousness fades. And when it stops entirely, consciousness ends. This idea fits well with much of what we observe. Changes in the brain clearly affect experience. A small shift in chemistry can alter mood. A disruption in certain areas can affect memory, perception, or identity. The connection between brain and mind is undeniable. And yet, as we have gently explored, there are moments where this model feels incomplete. Experiences that occur when the brain is not functioning in its usual way. Memories that remain unusually clear. A sense of structure, continuity, awareness, even as the physical system begins to falter. These moments do not necessarily contradict the idea that the brain plays a central role, but they do invite us to consider another possibility, one that has been suggested in different forms across both science and philosophy. What if the brain does not create consciousness, but filters it? This idea may feel unfamiliar at first, but it can be understood through a simple analogy. Imagine a radio. When you turn it on, music begins to play. The sound is clear, structured, meaningful. If the radio is damaged, the sound may become distorted or disappear entirely. From this perspective, it might seem as though the radio is creating the music, but in reality, the music exists as a signal carried through the air. The radio is not the source, it is the receiver. It takes a wide, complex signal and translates it into something we can hear. In the same way, the brain may act as a kind of receiver or filter, taking a broader field of consciousness and shaping it into the specific, focused experience we call being a person. Under normal conditions, this filter is precise. It selects certain information, organizes it, maintains a stable sense of self. It keeps experience aligned with the physical body, with the environment, with the flow of time. But under extreme conditions, that filtering process may change. It may loosen, become less restrictive, allowing experience to expand beyond its usual boundaries. This could help explain why some near-death experiences include a sense of unity, of connection, of awareness that feels less confined, not because something entirely new has been created, but because something normally filtered has been revealed. Of course, this is only a model. Just like the idea of the brain as a generator, it is a way of thinking, a lens through which we can interpret what we observe. And like all models, it has its strengths and its limitations. The generator model is grounded in measurable processes. It aligns with what we know about the brain's role in shaping experience. The filter model, while more difficult to test directly, offers a way to account for experiences that seem to extend beyond those processes. Neither model, on its own, provides a complete answer, but together they open a space for deeper exploration, because perhaps The relationship between brain and consciousness is not as simple as one creating the other. It may be more like a partnership, a dynamic interaction where the brain shapes, organizes and focuses experience, while consciousness itself may have properties that are not fully contained within that system. This idea does not require us to abandon science. It simply invites us to expand the questions we are asking, to consider that what we observe in the brain may be part of a larger picture, a picture that we are still in the process of understanding. And as we continue, we can begin to explore what happens when the usual sense of self, the feeling of being a separate individual, begins to soften. Because in many near-death experiences, as this sense of self does not remain fixed, it changes gently, as if the boundaries that define you begin to dissolve, just slightly, revealing something broader beneath. As we begin to consider the possibility that the brain may shape or filter our experience of consciousness, another subtle shift comes into view, not in what is perceived, but in who is perceiving. In everyday life, the sense of self feels steady. You wake up in the morning and there's a quiet continuity. The same voice in your thoughts, the same perspective behind your eyes, the same feeling of being a separate individual, moving through the world. This sense of I is so familiar that it rarely draws attention to itself. It simply feels natural. But under certain conditions, this sense of self can begin to change, not disappear entirely, but soften, loosen, become less defined. In near-death experiences, many people describe a moment when the boundaries that usually separate them from everything else begin to fade. At first, this may be subtle, a slight shift in perspective, a feeling of being less tied to the body, less anchored to a single point of view. But as the experience deepens, this shift can become more pronounced. The distinction between self and other becomes less clear. Awareness remains, but it is no longer centered in the same way. Instead of being located in one place, it feels more open, more expansive. Some describe this as a sense of unity, not a merging into something unfamiliar, but a recognition, as if the separation they once felt was not as absolute as it seemed. This can be difficult to describe, because our language is built around distinction. We speak of you and me, inside and outside, here and there. But in these experiences, as those distinctions may lose their usual meaning, not because they are erased, but because they are no longer the focus. It is like looking at the ocean. When you stand at the shore, you see individual waves, each one rising, moving, falling. They appear separate, distinct, but if you step back and take in the wider view, you begin to notice that all of those waves are part of the same body of water, different expressions of a single movement. In a similar way, the sense of self may be seen as one expression within a broader field of awareness, and in certain states, that broader field becomes more apparent. From a scientific perspective, there are ways to approach this shift. The brain contains networks that help maintain a sense of identity, a continuous narrative of who we are. These networks are active when we reflect on ourselves, when we think about our past, when we imagine our future. Under normal conditions, they help create the stable experience of being a person, but under extreme conditions or in altered states, the activity within these networks can change. When that happens, the usual sense of self may become less dominant. Thoughts may still arise, awareness may still be present, but the feeling of "this is happening to me" may soften. This can lead to experiences of openness, connection, or unity. Similar shifts have been observed in other contexts as well. In deep meditation, for example, individuals sometimes report a fading of the sense of self, accompanied by a feeling of calm and clarity. In certain altered states, the boundaries between subject and object may blur, creating a sense of being connected to something larger. These parallels suggest that the sense of self, while deeply ingrained, is not fixed. It is something that can change, depending on the state of the brain and the mind. But once again, the near-death context adds a layer of complexity, because the shift is not gradual or practiced as it might be in meditation. It occurs spontaneously, often without warning, in a moment where the body is under extreme stress, and yet the result is often described as peaceful, not disorienting, not chaotic, but clear. This is important, because one might expect that the loss of a stable sense of self would lead to confusion or distress, but in many reports, the opposite is true. The experience is described as calming, even comforting, as if the release of that boundary brings with it a sense of ease, like setting down something that was being carried without realizing how heavy it had become. This doesn't mean that the self is unimportant. In everyday life, it plays a crucial role. It allows us to navigate the world, to form relationships, to build meaning over time. But it may not be the whole story. It may be one layer within a larger structure, and in moments when that layer becomes quiet, other aspects of awareness may come forward, not replacing the self, but expanding beyond it. And as this sense of openness continues, another familiar element begins to shift, not the self, but time. Because in many of these experiences, time does not move in the way we expect. It stretches, it dissolves, or perhaps it simply loses its usual shape. As the sense of self becomes quieter and awareness feels less confined, another familiar structure begins to soften. Time. In everyday life, time feels steady. It moves forward, moment by moment, carrying us from one experience to the next. We wake up, we move through the day, we remember the past, and we imagine the future. Everything seems to follow a sequence. One thing happens, then another. And this sequence gives shape to our lives. It allows us to plan, to reflect, to understand cause and effect. It provides a kind of rhythm, a gentle structure that helps us make sense of change. But in many near-death experiences, this rhythm begins to shift, not abruptly, but gradually. At first, time may seem to slow down. Moments stretch, as if they are being gently pulled apart, allowing more detail to appear within them. A single instant may feel longer, fuller, more complete. This is not entirely unfamiliar. In everyday life, we sometimes notice time slowing during moments of intense focus or emotion. A sudden event, a near accident, a surprising realization can create the feeling that everything is happening in slow motion. But in near-death experiences, this effect can deepen further. Time does not simply slow, it becomes flexible. Some people describe it as if past, present, and future are no longer separate. Events do not unfold one after another, but appear together, like images laid side by side. There is no need to wait for one moment to lead to the next. Everything is already there, accessible, present. Others describe a complete absence of time, not as an empty void, but as a state in which the concept of time simply does not apply. There is awareness, there is experience, but there is no sense of duration, no before, no after, only now. This can be difficult to imagine because our thinking is so closely tied to time. We measure everything in relation to it. We speak in terms of minutes and hours, days and years. Even our memories are arranged along a timeline, but in these experiences, that timeline appears to dissolve, and with it, the usual sense of movement. You might think of it like watching a film. In normal viewing, the film plays frame by frame, creating the illusion of motion. Each image appears for a brief moment, then gives way to the next. But if you were able to see all the frames at once, laid out together, the experience would be very different. There would be no sequence, no progression, only a complete picture, containing every moment within it. In a similar way, near-death experiences sometimes feel as though time has shifted from a flowing line into something more like a landscape, a space where moments are not passing, but simply present. From a scientific perspective, this shift in time perception may be related to changes in how the brain processes information. Under normal conditions, the brain organizes experience into sequences. It keeps track of order, duration, and continuity. But when those systems are altered, the sense of time can change. In dreams, for example, long sequences can unfold within a short period of physical time. The brain compresses and expands experience, creating a different sense of duration. In moments of intense focus, attention becomes so concentrated that time seems to slow, allowing more detail to be perceived within each moment. These examples suggest that time, as we experience it, is not fixed. It is constructed, shaped by the way the brain organizes perception. And in extreme conditions, that organization may shift, leading to experiences where time behaves in unfamiliar ways. But once again, near-death experiences add a layer of depth, because the shift is not only about speed or duration, it is about structure. The entire framework of time appears to change, and this brings us back to the broader question. If time, as we experience it, is not absolute, but dependent on the processes of the brain, then what happens when those processes are altered? Does time itself change, or does our perception of it simply reveal something different? And if moments can be experienced together, rather than in sequence, what does that say about the nature of experience itself? These are not questions that require immediate answers. They're invitations, ways of gently expanding our perspective without forcing a conclusion. Because at the edge of life, many of the structures we rely on, self, time, perception, begin to soften, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more fluid, more open, and within that openness, new ways of experiencing may briefly emerge. Ways that do not replace our everyday understanding, but sit alongside it, offering a glimpse of something broader. And as this sense of timelessness settles, another aspect of these experiences becomes more visible. Not how time moves, but how meaning is felt. Because beyond the absence of judgment and beyond the clarity of memory, there is often a quiet thread running through everything, a feeling that is described again and again in different words across different lives, a feeling that we will now begin to explore gently as it unfolds. As the sense of time softens and experience becomes less bound by sequence, another quality begins to stand out, not something seen, not something heard, but something felt deeply and consistently. A change in how experience is understood. In everyday life, much of our thinking is shaped by evaluation. We measure, we compare, we ask whether something is right or wrong, successful or failed, worthy or not. This habit of judgment is so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. It becomes part of the background, a quiet voice that interprets everything we do. And yet, in many near-death experiences, this voice seems to grow quiet. not silenced by force, not removed completely, but replaced by something softer. Instead of judgment, there is understanding. Moments from a person's life may still appear, as we explored earlier, but they are not framed in terms of punishment or reward. There is no external authority, no figure assigning value, no sense of being evaluated from the outside. Instead, there is clarity, an awareness of what happened and how it affected others, a recognition that unfolds naturally, without accusation. This distinction is subtle but important, because it changes the emotional tone of the experience. Rather than fear, there is openness. Rather than defensiveness, there is acceptance. It is as if the need to judge, to separate experiences into categories of good and bad, has been set aside, and in its place, there is a simple seeing, a direct understanding of cause and effect, not as something imposed, but as something revealed. You might imagine it like looking at a reflection in still water. When the surface is disturbed, the image is unclear, shapes blur, details are lost, but when the water becomes calm, the reflection sharpens. Everything can be seen as it is, without distortion. In a similar way, when judgment fades, perception becomes clearer, not harsher, not more critical, but more accurate. This does not mean that difficult moments disappear. People often recall times when they caused harm, intentionally or unintentionally, moments they regret, choices they would not make again. But even in those moments, the experience is not one of condemnation, it is one of understanding. They see not only what they did, but why. The circumstances, the emotions, the limitations of perspective at the time, and often, they also feel the impact of those actions from the perspective of others, not as punishment, but as insight, as a way of fully grasping the ripple effect of a single moment. And within that insight, there is often a sense of compassion, not only for others, but for oneself. Mistakes are not erased, but they are placed within a larger context, seen as part of a process, rather than as fixed definitions. This shift, from judgment to understanding, can feel profoundly different, because it removes the tension that often accompanies self-evaluation, the need to defend, to justify, to explain. Instead, there is a quiet acceptance, a recognition that every moment, every action carries meaning, and that meaning can be understood without fear. From a scientific perspective, this may relate to changes in how the brain processes emotion. Under normal conditions, certain patterns of activity are associated with evaluation, comparison, and self-referential thinking. These patterns help us navigate the world, but they can also create a constant background of judgment. In altered states, these patterns may become less active, allowing other forms of processing to come forward, forms that are less focused on evaluation and more focused on connection and integration. This could help explain why near-death experiences are often described as calm, even when they involve confronting difficult memories, because the usual emotional responses, the ones tied to fear or self-criticism, may be reduced, leaving space for a different kind of awareness. But as always, this is only one way to understand it. It does not fully capture the depth of what is described, because what stands out is not just the absence of judgment, but the presence of something else, a quality that is difficult to define, but easy to recognize, a sense that understanding itself is enough, that seeing clearly, without distortion, without fear, carries its own form of resolution. And for many people, this becomes one of the most lasting impressions of the experience, not a specific image, not a particular event, but a way of seeing, a way of relating to themselves and to others, one that remains even after they return. And as this sense of understanding settles, another thread becomes more visible, a thread that seems to run through many of these experiences quietly, consistently, not as a dramatic element, but as a steady presence, a feeling that is not tied to any single moment, but that seems to surround everything, a feeling that is often described in the simplest possible terms as love. As the sense of judgment fades and understanding takes its place, there is often another quality that becomes more noticeable, not something dramatic, not something that demands attention, but something steady, quiet, and deeply present, a feeling that seems to surround the entire experience. Many people, when asked to describe it, choose a familiar word, love, but even as they say it, they often hesitate, because the word itself feels too small. In everyday life, love is usually tied to something specific, a person, a relationship, a memory. It can be warm and meaningful, but it can also be complicated. It can change over time. It can be influenced by expectation, by circumstance, by the natural ups and downs of human experience. What is described in many near-death experiences feels different. It is not directed toward a single individual. It is not dependent on conditions. It does not seem to increase or decrease. Instead, it is described as constant, a kind of presence that is simply there. Some describe it as a feeling of being completely accepted, not for what they have achieved or failed to achieve, but for what they are, without comparison, without requirement. Others describe it as a sense of connection, not just to people they know, but to everything around them, as if the boundaries that usually separate one thing from another have softened, and in that softness there is a recognition, a sense that everything is, in some way, related. This does not always appear in exactly the same form. The language varies, the imagery varies, but the underlying feeling appears often enough to be noticed, and when it does appear, it is often described as the most significant part of the experience, not the movement, not the light, not even the life review, but this quiet, steady sense of connection. From a scientific perspective, there are ways to approach this as well. The brain is capable of producing strong emotional states. Under certain conditions, chemicals associated with calm, with safety, with bonding, may be released. These can create feelings of warmth, of closeness, of well-being. In everyday life, we see this in moments of deep connection, when being with others feels meaningful, when the mind becomes quiet and the body relaxes. In extreme conditions, such responses may become amplified. The brain, responding to stress, may shift into a state that reduces fear and increases a sense of safety. This could help explain why near-death experiences are often described as peaceful, even when they occur in situations that would normally be frightening. But once again, this explanation addresses only part of the experience, because what people describe is not just a feeling of comfort, it is a feeling of significance, a sense that this connection matters, that it reveals something about the nature of experience itself, and this is where the scientific and the experiential begin to overlap. Because while science can describe the mechanisms that produce feelings, it does not always address the meaning those feelings carry, and meaning is a central part of these reports. For many individuals, this sense of connection leads to a shift in perspective, not during the experience alone, but afterward. They begin to see their lives differently. Relationships, take on greater importance. Small moments become more meaningful. Acts of kindness carry more weight. This is not because they have been instructed to think this way. It is not the result of an external rule. It arises naturally from the experience itself, as if something about that feeling remains, quietly influencing how they see the world. It is also important to note that not every near-death experience includes this sense of love. There are variations. Some experiences are more neutral. Others may include confusion or even distress. But even with that variation, the presence of this feeling appears often enough to stand out, not as a universal rule, but as a recurring pattern. And like other patterns we've explored, it invites attention, not because it proves anything, but because it suggests that certain aspects of these experiences are not random. They carry a consistency that may reflect underlying processes or deeper structures that we do not yet fully understand. And so, once again, we return to that quiet space of observation, holding both perspectives, the biological and the experiential, the measurable and the meaningful, allowing each to contribute without forcing one to replace the other, because perhaps understanding will not come from choosing between them, but from seeing how they fit together. And as we continue, we will begin to look at what happens when people return from these experiences, not just what they remember, but how those memories shape their lives. Because whatever these experiences may be, they do not simply end, they leave something behind. A shift, a quiet change that continues long after the moment itself has passed. As these experiences come to an end and awareness returns to the body, something subtle remains, not always visible from the outside, not something that can be easily measured in a single moment, but something that unfolds slowly, over time, a shift. For many individuals, returning from a near-death experience is not simply a return to life as it was before. The body recovers, the surroundings become familiar again, the routines of daily life resume, and yet, the perspective has changed. At first, this change may be difficult to describe. There is the memory of what was experienced, still clear, still present. But beyond that, there is a feeling, a quiet difference in how life is perceived. One of the most commonly reported changes is a reduced fear of death. This does not mean that people seek danger or become careless. Rather, the sense of finality that once surrounded the idea of death becomes less intense, less absolute. For someone who has felt awareness continue, even briefly, beyond the point where it should have ended, the idea of complete disappearance may no longer feel certain, and in place of that uncertainty, there's often a sense of calm, not certainty, but openness, a willingness to see death, not only as an ending, but as something that is not fully understood. This shift can influence how life itself is approached. When the fear of death becomes less dominant, other aspects of experience can come forward more clearly. Relationships, for example, often take on greater importance. Time spent with others, conversations, small gestures of care may feel more meaningful, not because they have changed, but because the way they're seen has changed. Moments that once passed unnoticed may now feel significant. Simple interactions, a kind word, a shared silence, can carry more weight. This does not mean that life becomes perfect. Challenges remain. Difficult emotions still arise. But the framework through which those experiences are understood may shift. There is often a greater sense of perspective, a recognition that many concerns, while real, are temporary, that what endures is not always what we expect. Some individuals also describe an increase in compassion, not as a deliberate choice, but as a natural response. Having experienced a state where understanding and connection were prominent, they may find it easier to relate to others, to listen, to respond with patience. This change does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, shaped by reflection, by memory, by the process of integrating the experience into everyday life. There are also cases where people report changes in intuition, a sense of awareness that feels slightly more attuned, more responsive. This does not necessarily imply anything beyond ordinary human perception. It may simply reflect a shift in attention, a greater sensitivity to subtle cues, a deeper engagement with the present moment. But to the person experiencing it, it can feel meaningful, as if something within them has become more open. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not all changes are easy. Returning to ordinary life after such an experience can be challenging. The clarity, the sense of connection, the absence of judgment may contrast sharply with the complexity of daily life. Expectations, responsibilities, conflicts, all of these return, and they do not always align with what was experienced. Some individuals may struggle to express what happened to them. Language can feel insufficient. Others may find it difficult to reconcile their experience with their previous beliefs. This process of integration can take time. It may involve rethinking assumptions, adjusting perspectives, finding new ways to understand both the experience and the life that continues afterward. From a scientific point of view, these after effects can be seen as part of how significant experiences influence the brain. Events that carry strong emotional meaning can lead to lasting changes in how we think, how we feel, how we respond to the world. They can reshape patterns of attention, influence priorities, and alter the way memories are organized. In this sense, near-death experiences may function as deeply impactful events, capable of shifting long-standing patterns. But once again, this explanation does not fully capture the depth of what is described, because for many individuals, the change is not only psychological, it feels fundamental, as if something about their understanding of life has been expanded, not replaced, not erased, but widened. And within that wider perspective, there is often a quieter relationship with uncertainty, a willingness to accept that not everything can be explained, that some aspects of experience do remain open, and this openness becomes part of how life is lived, not as a question that must be answered, but as a space that can be explored. And as we approach the end of this journey, we return to the question that has been quietly present from the beginning, not as something to resolve, but as something to consider, gently, without urgency. Because what these experiences reveal may not be a final answer, but something else, a doorway, an invitation to look again at what we think we know about consciousness, about life, and about what it means to be aware at all. As we reach this quiet point, after moving through experience, science, memory, and meaning, something begins to settle, not an answer, but a feeling, a sense that the question we started with may be larger than it first appeared. We began with a simple moment, a heart that stops, a brain that grows quiet, a point where, according to everything we understand, experience should come to an end, and yet, for some, it does not. Instead, there are reports of awareness, of perception, of memory, structured, consistent, and often deeply meaningful. Along the way, we have explored many ways of understanding this. We have looked at the biology, the fading of oxygen, the quieting of brain activity, the brief and fragile moments where patterns may still appear. Even at the edge of life, we have considered the role of the brain as a system that organizes, filters, and shapes experience. And we have also allowed space for another possibility, that consciousness may not be fully contained within the structures we can observe, not as a conclusion, but as a question. Because at every step, we find something interesting. Each explanation offers insight. Each perspective reveals part of the picture, but none seems to complete it entirely. This is not a failure of science. It is a reflection of where we are. Science moves forward by asking questions, by refining models, by testing ideas against observation. And when something does not fit easily into existing frameworks, it becomes an invitation, an opening, a place where understanding can grow. Near-death experiences, in this sense, are not answers. They are signals, not telling us what to believe, but showing us where our understanding is still incomplete. And perhaps that is their quiet value, not in proving that life continues after death, not in confirming that consciousness exists beyond the brain, but in reminding us that we do not yet fully understand what consciousness is. In everyday life, consciousness feels simple. You're aware, you think, you feel, you experience the world from a particular point of view. And because this is constant, it seems obvious, almost self-explanatory. But when we begin to look more closely, the simplicity begins to dissolve. What is awareness made of? How does it arise? Why does it feel the way it does? These are questions that reach beyond any single field of study. They touch neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, even physics. And despite all that has been learned, they remain open, not because they cannot be answered, but because they are part of something deeper, something that may require new ways of thinking. Near-death experiences sit at the edge of this mystery. They do not provide a clear map, but they point toward regions we have not fully explored. They show us that under certain conditions, the usual relationship between brain and experience may not behave exactly as we expect, and that observation, simple as it is, carries meaning. It suggests that our current models, while powerful, may not yet be complete, and that is not something to fear. It is something to appreciate, because it means there is still more to discover, more to understand, more to explore, quietly, patiently, without rushing towards certainty. At the same time, it is important to remain grounded, to recognize that not every unanswered question points to a single conclusion. There are many possibilities. Some may remain within the framework of the brain, others may extend beyond it. And perhaps the truth, if there is a single truth to be found, lies somewhere we have not yet imagined. So rather than choosing one explanation, we can allow ourselves to rest in the question, to hold it gently, like a thought that does not need to be resolved, but simply observed. Because sometimes understanding begins not with answers, but with attention, with the willingness to look and to keep looking, even when the path is not fully clear. And as you sit with that thought, you may notice something else, a quiet shift, not in the ideas themselves, but in how they feel. The urgency to know may begin to soften. The need for certainty may become less important. And in that space, there's room for something else. Curiosity, wonder, a calm openness to the possibility that consciousness, like the universe itself, is more expansive than we currently understand. And perhaps that is enough, not as a final answer, but as a place to rest, a place where the question can remain, gently, without pressure, and where you can begin to drift just a little further into stillness. And so we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.